Good morning and welcome. I'm Alex Vatanka. I'm the director of the Iran program here at the Middle East Institute in Washington, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's event, Scandal and Divisions in Tehran and its Impact on US-Iran Relations. Foreign Minister Javad Zarif's recent leaked interview in which he basically claimed that he as foreign minister has very limited power to shape foreign policy has raised questions about the division of power and labor in the Islamic Republic. Zarif has come under attack for admitting to a reality that has arguably long been known to those of who watched the Islamic Republic, that elected officials and government of President Rouhani or those before him are powerless when confronted by the unelected centers of power in that system, namely the office of the Supreme Leader and the Revolutionary Guards. The Zarif scandal broke out just before Iran holds its elections on June the 18th. Zarif, who many reformist leaders had hoped would run for presidency, has by all accounts been forced out because of this leak. We can expect Zarif and the leak around his interview to continue to echo for weeks and months to come. The Iranian public had very low level of interest in the upcoming elections to begin with, but with the statements that Zarif made, I think the voter turnout will probably be even less now. There are also questions obviously arising out of this for the United States as Washington and Tehran continue to negotiate in Vienna to find a way to revive the 2015 nuclear deal. One key question to ask is how certain can the United States be about the ability of the Iranian state to collectively adhere to any new nuclear agreement reached in Vienna? Today, I'm pleased to welcome three experts who will discuss these issues with us and give us their perspectives. In the interest of time, I will not read out all their impressive bios. You'll find them on the MEI website. I'll very quickly introduce them simply by referring to their titles. We'll start the conversation with Morad Vaisi, who's the editor of Iran International, a very popular Iranian channel operating outside of Iran. Next, we have Barbara Slavin. Barbara is the director of the Iran Future Initiative at the Atlantic Council. She's a veteran Iran watcher. And last but not least, we have Kenneth Katzman, who is a senior analyst at the Congressional Research Service, also a veteran Iran watcher. A quick note of admin here. To submit your questions, please use the Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please email events@mei.edu. And feel free to ask a question anytime throughout the panel. I'll be looking for your questions and I'll factor in as many as I can as we go through this hopefully 1 hour long conversation. All right, with all that said, let me start off with Morad. Morad, tell us from your perspective, what are the latest reactions to Zarif's comments in Iran? How has the last few weeks been? Your organization were the first ones to reveal to the world that leaked interview. What do you make of it all?
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody, and thank you for this opportunity. I want to talk about the role of Zarif in Iran situation and including 4 big misunderstandings about Iran situation. Somebody thinks Zarif is the foreign minister of Iran, but I think main misunderstanding is Zarif is foreign minister of Supreme Leader, not foreign minister of Iran. Because when we talk about foreign ministry in other countries, concept completely is different. I want to talk about 4 misunderstandings, including Zarif situation. The first is the structure of power in Iran, and then about meaning of election in Iran. Now we have a selection, not election. And third misunderstanding about somebody says we have a 2 wing, reformist and hardliner in Iran. But I think now, when we talk today, majority of reformists, their situation completely destroyed in Iran. We don't have reformists. And fourth misunderstanding is about somebody says it's possible some military action by IRGC against Mr. Khamenei or some cleric. All of them, I think, is misunderstanding. And when we have a misunderstanding, we can't understand the situation of Iran, behavior of Iran, and decision-making in Iran. The first about the structure of power. Somebody says the Supreme Leader is Iran is very powerful, IRGC is very powerful, but we have a president and we have a foreign policy, and president is the second person in Iran. Completely is wrong. Because when we talk about Islamic Republic of Iran now, I think 80%, 90%, we talk about Supreme Leader and IRGC commander. Somebody said, yes, we understand the president, it's not powerful. He is the head of government. But I can say he is not the head of government. In Iran, we have 18 ministries. At least half of them controlled by Supreme Leader, not by president, including Foreign Ministry, Defense Ministry, Intelligence Ministry, Interior Ministry, Culture, High Education, education for schools. President, it's not the head of cabinet. It's not the head of Ministry of Council. And in the other side, when we talk about Supreme Leader, the Supreme Leader not only is Supreme Leader, in fact, he is the commander of military forces, IRGC, Classic Army, paramilitary basis. He is the head of only radio and TV in Iran. We have official only one TV and radio. In fact, he is the head of this TV and radio. He is the head of judiciary system. He is the head of intelligence service in IRGC. He can control all files in domestic policy, in foreign policy, in economy, in culture. In other side, when we talk about Revolutionary Guard now is the main domestic player after Supreme Leader in domestic policy. The intelligence unit in IRGC, it's the main player, not only as a main intelligence service, but as a main player in domestic policy. They can talk about election. They can say who must be arrested by government. And now when we see the Iran foreign policy, main file is under control of IRGC. Iran-US tension, Iran-Saudi tension, Iran-Israel tension, Persian Gulf policy, Middle East policy, Iran's policy in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Afghanistan, Pakistan. All of them are under control by IRGC. When we talk about Islamic Republic of Iran now, 80% we talk about IRGC and Ayatollah Khamenei. Then, why this is important? Because now in Iran, we have an election, and today they start to candidate go to Interior Minister to register their name. In this election, Supreme Leader and IRGC commander are main player because Guardian Council is very important in Iran election. They can say, yes, you can be candidate or you can't. And Guardian Council completely is under control by Supreme Leader. And majority of candidates, they are member of IRGC now. When we talk about election in United States, completely is different than Iran. For example, if in United States, Biden says, yes, majority of Republican leaders must be arrested. For example, Ted Cruz, Trump, Lindsey Graham. This is election.
You're muted. Murad, you got muted there.
Sent to prison. Their newspaper, all of them closed. I was member of Iranian newspaper in Iran, in reformist wing. For me, I was working in 14 newspapers, all of them closed by government. When they can participate in election with main candidate, for example, Mr. Khatami or Mr. Mousavi or Mr. Karbi, we can't talk about competition in Iran. We can't talk about election in Iran. This is selection. Completely is different than in United States. Some American Iranian and some American, they said, yes, we have this problem in other countries. It's same. No, it's not same. In United States, election is free. And Biden cannot arrest the leaders of other Republicans. And Biden cannot close the newspaper of Republican. And Biden cannot say you can run an election or no. This is second misunderstanding about election. And third misunderstanding, it's about we have a two-wing in Iran. I think somebody says, yes, we have a hardliner reformist, and somebody in the United States says, no, hardliner are very, very powerful. I don't talk about this one. I talk about this one. Reformist wing has no power now. They don't participate in high-ranking position in government. They don't participate in foreign policy. They don't participate in main process in domestic policy. When they can participate, we can say we have a two-wing. Only we have a one-wing, Supreme Leader and IRGC. And the last one, it's about the possibility of IRGC military action against Supreme Leader. I think completely is wrong. Relation between IRGC and Supreme Leader is very, very powerful. And IRGC not only is supporter of Supreme Leader, now IRGC, as Zarif said, IRGC is government, is state, it's sovereignty of Islamic Republic of Iran. They are not supporter of regime, they are regime. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Murad. Barbara, let me turn to you, and actually I wouldn't mind hearing your reaction to what you just heard Murad say, perhaps, but also if you could develop it further by adding to what you think the reaction to the so-called Zarif audio leak has been in Washington and elsewhere from your vantage point. Has it meant that folks look at the Islamic Republic differently, or it wasn't a surprise, really? Barbara, please.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate. I don't disagree with much of Murad's analysis, and it's frankly not news to those of us who followed Iran over the last 20, 30, even 40 years. We've seen the IRGC take an increasing role politically, economically, certainly has always been preeminent in terms of security issues. The Zarif tape, I think there were a couple of things that were new for us. For example, his comments about Russia, and that Russia had been less than enthusiastic about the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal, that Qasem Soleimani, the late leader of the Quds Force, had even tried to intervene with the Russians. Yeah. That was news to me. But that Zarif was not in control of Iran's foreign policy? No, he's told us that repeatedly. And as someone who in my journalistic career and also as a think tanker has met Zarif, dozens of times, he's always told us that all he could do really was affect policy along the margins. That said, I think that who the president is does matter, because it affects Iran's image abroad. It affects the kind of individuals who were named to positions like foreign minister, and how successful they are or aren't in terms of negotiations with the West and with the United States in particular. And under Zarif, we saw this incredible breakthrough where the United States, in the form of John Kerry and a large negotiating team of 100 some odd people, were sitting with their Iranian counterparts, putting together an agreement. Under Ahmadinejad, the regime was not capable of that. Under Saeed Jalili, the former chief negotiator for the Iranian system, Iran was not capable of reaching an agreement like the JCPOA. So it matters. In terms of its impact on the negotiations that are going on now, I think it has complicated the situation. And it has made a difficult process even more difficult. It's slowed it down. And I think the chief question we have now is whether there can be an agreement reached in Vienna before the June 18 elections, or whether this process is going to drag through. That said, it's a less difficult situation now than it was in 2010, 2011, even while Ahmadinejad was still there, or even into the Rouhani period, because the JCPOA exists. It's there, the provisions are there. So the question is, how do you sequence a mutual return to compliance? What adjustments have to be made because of changes that have taken place over the last few years, particularly in terms of Iran's introduction of more advanced centrifuges, its accumulation of more nuclear knowledge, which can't be rolled back, and what I'm sure Ken will talk about, namely the sanctions that have been added and put on Iran under new authorities, even though they're essentially the same old nuclear sanctions. So it's a question whether this can all be arranged, whether sequencing can be agreed to before the elections. But in terms of who's in charge in Iran, I mean, this is no secret to anybody who's followed the country. It's always been the Supreme Leader. It's always been the IRGC, and the IRGC's role has only increased because of the actions, frankly, of the United States in quitting the Iran nuclear deal, vindicating Ayatollah Khamenei's views that the United States is not a country that can be trusted to keep its promises, that the US is irredeemably hostile to the Islamic Republic. This he has now been vindicated in because of Trump. And I'm afraid that we will see an IRGC type president. We will see a consolidation of the regime. Question is, will it be more cohesive and effective than it was when it was Ahmadinejad, who was always kind of a loose cannon and not very competent in the way that he ran the government and clashed with Khamenei? Can there be a cohesive government, or will we see factions within factions? If there's anything I've learned about studying Iran and going there, is that it never really is cohesive, even when you have allegedly one wing in power, or you have one sort of dominant institution. There's always infighting and one individual or one group trying to gain advantage over the other. So I think we're in for an interesting election, even if it's more a selection than an election. Probably a very low turnout. And I'm just interested to hear from my co-panelists who they think the candidate will be. Will it be Raisi? Will it be Saeed Mohammed, this sort of younger, fresh face from the IRGC? Who will be the standard bearer, and will you get more than 30% turnout? Those are the questions I have. But I think the nuclear talks will proceed, and the Zarif tapes. I never thought Zarif would run for president. I don't think he wants that job. He's had a hard enough time being foreign minister. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Barbara. And you raised some very good questions. We'll come back to those. Ken, I wonder, if you are United States and you're trying to get Iran back into the nuclear deal, and the one thing the Iranians care about more than anything else is sanctions relief and removal of some of these people on these designated lists. And you hear Zarif, who says, actually, I don't really matter. I don't make these big decisions. The ones that do are those people in the Revolutionary Guards who happen to be mostly designated by the United States, which raises the question, if you want to get the issue fixed, you want to reconsider removing some of these entities and individuals from the sanctions list, which the Iranians complain have been, I think the word they use is many of them have been relabeled, people who were have been designated in the last few years, not because of nuclear related work they've done, but because of terrorism, human rights violations, and so forth. My question to you is this: how easy would that be for the United States to make sanctions relief possible aimed at pleasing the Revolution Guard's inner circle? We can't hear you, Kate. You got to unmute yourself. There.
Okay.
There you
Thank you, Alex, and thanks to the Middle East Institute. I am batting for the Congressional Research Service today. I am fully vaccinated as well. On the issue of sanctions, let me just address that. The United States has said there's a category of sanctions relief that U.S. negotiators term difficult cases. So reading between the lines based on off-the-record interviews that have been given, on named interviews, it appears the United States has agreed to lift those sanctions on Iran's economy: oil, banking, manufacturing, mining, port operations, etc. The issue is the Trump administration designated certain economic entities, such as the central bank, most notably, as a terrorism entity, as well as other economic entities. Now, under the nuclear deal, terrorism-related entities in the first go-round, when the JCPOA was first agreed to, terrorism entities were not delisted. They remained listed for sanctions. However, as I said, the Trump administration has named certain economic entities as terrorist entities. And this has been the crux of the debate. Now, it looks like the administration has agreed to revoke those terrorism designations because Iran will, if, for example, the central bank remains designated for sanctions, Iran will not get the benefits of sanctions relief. And therefore, that is considered inconsistent with the nuclear deal. So it looks like the United States has agreed to lift those terrorism designations of key economic entities. Now, you mentioned prominent actors. This, I think, is those difficult cases that the U.S. negotiators have talked about. It's sort of unstated. What happened was President Trump in June 2019, he issued an executive order sanctioning the office of the Supreme Leader. Based on support, the named individuals supporting terrorism, proliferation, destabilizing the Middle East, etc. This was a sanction that was not enforced prior to the JCPOA when it was agreed to. It was a brand new sanction. And under that, there are a number of prominent personalities that have been sanctioned. Now, the issue is, I don't necessarily read that sanction as inconsistent with the JCPOA to the extent that it has to be lifted, because these actors are primarily not economic actors. There were other actors in the JCPOA that were designated for human rights abuses and other offenses that were not, their sanctions were not revoked on them the first time the JCPOA was implemented. So I don't read it as inconsistent. And this is why the US says they're difficult cases, because Iran obviously wants these personalities to not be sanctioned. These are prominent personalities. I'll read a few of them. Zarif himself was sanctioned. Khamenei's son Mujtaba was sanctioned under this executive order. Ibrahim Raisi, who was just mentioned as a possible candidate for president, has been sanctioned. The head of the Supreme National Security Committee, Ali Shamkhani, the former deputy commander of the IRGC, was named. A former Speaker of the Parliament, Gholam Haddad Adel, is sanctioned under that. The head of the Guardians Council, Janati, and several Guardians Council members are sanctioned under that order. So these are very prominent actors that are sanctioned under this particular order. And I'm sure that the Iranian negotiators are saying, to the United States indirectly, the talks are indirect, we need these sanctions lifted. We cannot go home to Tehran and say we could not get these personalities delisted from sanctions. That is just not going to fly. But, you know, as I said, that sanction is not necessarily, I don't read it. I'm not authoritative. I'm not speaking for the United States government, but I don't interpret it as inconsistent with the JCPOA to the extent that the United States would be required to lift it. However, I don't think there's going to be a deal reached in Vienna unless that sanction is revoked, at least for these prominent personalities. Now, there were a few minor economic entities, some of the clerical foundations that are well known. Some other minor entities are also listed under that sanctioned under that order, so there could be a partial lifting and keep the order in place and lift some personalities, but not others. We'll see. So this is what I think the crux of what may be holding up, you know, the sanctions part of the debate in Vienna is right now. But I think most of the main issues have been resolved. I mean, Iran clearly needs the sanctions relief. Just to talk briefly, the IMF says Iran only has usable foreign exchange reserves right now of about $4 billion, which for a country of 80 million people or so is not that much. So they've got about $90 billion that is still locked up in various accounts abroad. There's been some discussion of maybe the United States agreeing to cooperate with the release of some of those assets as a goodwill gesture. That hasn't quite been agreed to. See, the problem is these assets are in foreign currencies, which probably would have to be changed into US dollars to be used, and they would have to come into the US financial system. So the Biden administration would have to approve that. It's very complicated. But anyway, no matter who's elected in June, you know, Iran needs that sanctions relief. Are they desperate? No. But, you know, obviously these sanctions are biting quite significantly. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. That wonderful set of points you made. And one that I think many people in Tehran will be scratching their heads is this notion that their government is not desperate for sanctions relief, because it tells you the distance between the people where they are in terms of their livelihood and where the government's thinking are. But let me take something you said, Ken, and a question that Barbara raised and ask Murad the following question. Murad, I didn't really ask you, and we haven't gotten into it, and it will be pure speculation, but in your best estimation, how did that interview get leaked? Who could have been behind it? And could we read that to suggest that there is a view, even perhaps a dominant view in the Revolutionary Guards in the office of the Supreme Leader, that does not believe that any deal with the United States is possible, that they've given up on it entirely, that when they say China is the future, they mean it, that they're going to put all their eggs in the Chinese basket. Therefore, this was an effort to, if you will, sabotage any possible deal. I mean, I know this is pure speculation on my part, but I want you to go back and think about you know, that leak, that audio leak. What motivations might have been in play then?
I think Supreme Leader and IRGC commander, they need tactical deal with United States, but they will continue anti-US policy. Why? About tactical deal, Supreme Leader needs this deal. Why? When we talk about tactical deal, I think Supreme Leader needs new nuclear deal with United States, then remove all sanction, including oil sanction, because for Supreme Leader, main thing is oil sanction. Remove oil sanction, and then Iran can send their oil to market. They can get oil money. They can send to banking system. system, and they can get this money and receive this money to their to improve their situation in domestic policy and send this money to their proxy in Middle East. For Supreme Leader, in this line, deal is finished. Deal, it's not meaning any improve in Iran-US relations. They need anti-US approach and anti-US strategy. Why? Because they can justify any problem inside of country with Iran-US tension. They can say, yes, we have an enemy, big enemy, is in superpower. When we have a lot of problem in domestic and about economy, because we have a big enemy. This is about Supreme Leader. For example, last time when they had a nuclear deal with Obama, when Obama and Rouhani, they talk each other by telephone, and Supreme Leader said, no, this is not, we can't tolerate this one. Because he think only we need nuclear deal to remove our oil sanction and get oil money. And for Revolutionary Guard, it's same. They need tactical deal, but they will continue anti-US policy. Why? Because with this policy, they are main player in domestic policy, they are main player in foreign policy, they are one of the big economic player, and no, they are one of main player in culture section. For example, in cinema, last decade, they don't have any power in cinema in Iran. Now in Fajr Festival film, in main film festival in Iran, and majority of winners, they are coming from Revolutionary Guard culture section. We say OJ organization.
Murad,
I think they need tactical deal, and it's possible tactical deal between Iran and US in Vienna, but they will continue anti-US policy, not only in Iran, US tension, Iran-Israel tension, Iran-Saudi tension. They will continue to support their proxy in Middle East, and they will continue their foreign policy in Middle East.
Okay, I need to quickly ask you a follow-up question before I turn to Barbara. Look, you mentioned the Obama deal of 2015. There were lots of agreements signed. Lots of companies went to Iran, signed all sorts of deals. Very few of it actually came to be implemented. I mean, that's a hard reality, that as long as you have the type of relationship with the United States that the Islamic Republic has had, you will never be able to have a normal economy. And if you don't have a normal economy, you have a very angry population, and they'll come out in the streets. So it's actually a no-brainer, if you will. Maybe Khamenei doesn't get that. Maybe Khamenei doesn't care because he's 82 and he wants to go out with a legacy intact, that he was the anti-American crusader, if you will. Okay, crusader, what a choice of word there. But the Revolutionary Guards in their 50s and their 60s, who obviously want to take over and want to have more power and access to riches, are they going to think in the same exact way in your view? Are they not going to see the need to make some serious changes in the attitude towards the United States for their own sake in Tehran?
No, I think they continue this policy, not only Supreme Leader, but IRGC commander, but because they have interest and benefit in this policy. Why they need to change this policy? If United States is enemy of Islamic Republic of Iran, as Supreme Leader and IRGC, they said, they have a very good interest and benefit in this situation, because when Supreme Leader and IRGC, they says, yes, United States is enemy, they will continue their influence in domestic policy, they will continue in their influence in foreign policy, they don't need to change. And I think main problem in US-Iran policy is IRGC and Supreme Leader. For example, in 2015, when we had a nuclear deal, exactly after one day, Supreme Leader says, US companies, they cannot come to Iran. And think in 1 week, Supreme IRGC commander, they test one missile with, they write in this missile, the Israel must be destroyed. Why? They had a nuclear deal, but they wanted to say, you anti-US policy, anti-Israel policy, and our policy in Middle East must be continued.
Right. Barbara, I want to hear your reaction to what Murad said, and I want to be a bit provocative. And Murad, forgive me if I'm putting words in your mouth. I don't think you meant to say it this way, but I certainly, that's one of my takeaways, which is if the United States wants to have normal relations with this country called Iran of 82 million people, it better hope or work towards regime change, because Islamic Republic is not going to look for normal relations, because it's just not in their interest. And it's not so much about their foreign policy, it's about consolidating and hanging on to as much power as they can in Iran. That the United States, it's being used by this Iranian hardline faction as an excuse to hang on to power, to excuse away all the shortcomings and so forth. What do you make of that argument, Laura?
Well, you know, I think anybody who thinks that they can change the regime in Iran better tell me what comes after and how this is supposed to be accomplished. I mean, people have been talking about regime change for more than 40 years now. Unfortunately, as the military has become more and more entrenched, this prospect seems to be even more difficult to realize. But, you know, look, anything can happen. The regime can fall, obviously. But I don't think the United States is the one that should be preaching this, especially given our record in the region, which hasn't turned out very well. It's difficult to envision normal, quote unquote, relations between the United States and Iran, particularly while Iran maintains such a hostile policy toward Israel. This has been, and I think the mention of the missile with death to Israel, you know, I'm sure people saw that video of this idiot who was burning an Israeli flag on Quds Day and managed to set himself on fire as well. Thought it was a wonderful metaphor for this policy, which has, you know, maybe it looks a little bit more intelligent these days with what's been going on in Jerusalem and the brutality that we've seen with Israelis trying to evict Palestinians from their homes. But most Iranians don't care about Israel. They don't care about the Palestinians. It's really not something that has served Iran's interests over the last 40 years to be the most rejection, more, what is it, hotter than the soup, I think is the Persian expression, more Palestinian than the Palestinians. So there are many impediments. But, you know, Murad mentioned the Supreme Leader saying no to American companies. Well, Iran was supposed to buy $20 billion worth of Boeing airplanes, and that deal would have gone through if Donald Trump hadn't pulled out of the JCPOA, and that would have been a major precedent in changing the economic relations between the United States and Iran, and it could have led to other things. We'll never know what could have happened if the JCPOA had been preserved and if the United States hadn't been the first to pull out of it and to violate it. You know, the problem is Iran now has that experience, and the Supreme Leader said that the JCPOA was a test, and that if the United States passed this test, that other items could be discussed. Well, the United States failed that test. So I think the most we can hope for, you talked about a tactical agreement. Well, we need a tactical agreement with Iran. So it's not enriching uranium to 60%. It's not reducing its theoretical breakout time to a matter of weeks instead of many months. We need to stabilize the situation. I'd also be interested to know what the other panelists think of the talks that Iran has been carrying on with the Saudis. Efforts that have been made at least to tamp down that conflict. Iran still has lots of areas it can play in. I mean, there's still rockets being fired at Americans in Iraq. I just saw that the Americans who maintain Iraq's F-16s are leaving now because of all the rockets that have been fired at the Balad air base. and so that is continuing and is certainly a worrisome development. We still have incidents in the Persian Gulf, very reckless behavior by the IRGC Navy. So a lot of tension there. I think, though, if we could restore the nuclear deal, that might reduce some of those tensions. And Joe Biden wants peace and quiet in the Middle East. He doesn't want to get sucked in. He wants to leave. He wants to reduce the American footprint there, which is all something that the IRGC and the Supreme Leader would claim to want as well. So I still think that a return to the JCPOA serves U.S. interests, U.S. national interests. And then the question is whether there's any prospect for building on it. That may be more complicated.
Thank you, Barbara. I wanted to come back to, because there was actually one question specifically aimed at you, and I'll come to that in the next round. Ken, let me ask you this, and by the way, by all means, do react to anything you've heard since you last spoke. But here's my question to you. When I hear about millions of barrels of Iranian oil going to Malaysia and showing up in China, the question that comes to my mind, well, actually two questions. How sustainable is the sanctions regime going forward, 10 years, 15 years down the road? How sustainable is it? How much does it cost the United States in terms of enforcement cost? I mean, is this something that the US economy could do without? I'm sure that the answer is affirmative, but I don't actually know the answer. So go ahead, Ken, tell us.
Thank you. Well, I mean, you asked me to react. I mean, the context of this is Iran has become a fairly powerful country. This has all been lost. I think, the strategic debate. Iran is now a major strategic threat to the United States. Let's not forget, a year ago, a little more than a year ago, Iran launched, 50 or 60 large ballistic missiles in what was really the largest ballistic missile strike on any U.S. troops like ever. Let's not forget that with one cruise missile volley, Iran basically shut down Saudi oil production for weeks. This was unexpected. 5 years ago, no one would said Iran is capable of these type of precision, this type of strikes. So Iran has become a major strategic problem for the United States to wrestle with. Now, you mentioned, obviously, the United States has used sanctions as a core spearhead in its efforts to counter Iran. Now, are they sustainable? They've been sustained. I mean, one thing we did not talk about, and what I'm sure the Iranian negotiators are arguing for in Vienna, and I do not think they're getting it, is access to the U.S. financial system. In the JCPOA of 2015, Iran did not get direct access to the U.S. financial system. President Obama toyed with it because Iran was complaining, our economy isn't improving because companies can't access dollars. They need dollars for transactions and they can't get it, so they're not dealing with us. And President Obama toyed with it, didn't do it. And now the Iranians are saying, look, guys, we did not get the benefits that we were promised from the last, when the JCPOA was implemented by the United States, because you did not give us access to the U.S. financial system. And from what I can read between the lines, the Biden team is not giving ground on this. Maybe they're saving that for the next round, the so-called follow-on talks on missiles and Mideast stability issues, because that's something Iran is going to need to get sanctions relief. They're going to need, companies need access to the US dollars. There is not enough dollars outside the United States to complete large transactions. So this is a key issue. Now, you mentioned, obviously Iran is exporting 700,000 or 800,000 barrels a day of oil to China. This at a time when China does not have an exception for U.S. sanctions, or China could be sanctioned at any time for these purchases. Iran is exporting probably over 1 million barrels a day again, even though all the sanctions are still in place. Are they sustainable? Yeah, they probably are sustainable. You mentioned the U.S. economy is what, $25 trillion economy. Iran is less than $1 trillion economy. So the United States economy does not need Iran to boom or to be sustained. That is just not really a consideration. It's the strategic considerations of Iran's nuclear program and the Middle East that are the drivers behind potentially providing sanctions relief in a revived JCPOA.
Thanks, Ken. I'll come back to the questions here for you as well. Murad, something that Ken just mentioned, this idea of a follow-up set of negotiations where you can discuss other issues than just centrifuges. How, when you look at the Iranian political landscape, when you look at the trouble the country has gone through over the last few years on something as the Financial Action Task Force, and I don't even know where it is now, the number of times they've debated it in the Expediency Council, in the Parliament, at all sorts of levels, and everyone knows what the issue is. But something is well, maybe not minor, but certainly not as sensitive as Iran's regional strategy. My question is, what could possibly, if there is good news out of Vienna, and there is a nuclear deal, JCPOA of 2015 is revived, and everyone agrees that in order to be able to sustain this new deal, so not in 4 years' time, another executive order by an American president won't end it, that you need to build on this agreement, where could you build on it? Could you build on the missiles? Could you build on what Iran is doing in the region? And let me link that to something Barbara mentioned, which is the ongoing talks with the Saudis. So Gulf states in particular are going their own way because they feel the United States wants them to talk to Iran. They don't want to be seen as the spoilers in this new environment of US-Iran talking. So could you see a set of dynamic coming together and actually softening Iran's regional stance and making it more open to not just making concessions, but open to a dialogue involving a number of states, including the United States?
Thank you. I think main thing for Supreme Leader and IRGC commander is what is power and how we can take this power. In foreign policy, in domestic policy. In domestic policy, for Supreme Leader and IRGC, two things is very important. How we can manage protest by people. Because in last decade, we had a lot of big protests by people in 2017 and 2019. In 2019, according to my research, we had a protest against government in 30 provinces. Iran has 31, I think, provinces and local government. Mm-hmm. We had a protest against government in 30 of them. It's in all of local government. For government, main thing is how we can keep our government when we have a lot of protesting inside of country. I think main approach by Supreme Leader and IRGC commander is we need more power and more influence by IRGC. IRGC can keep government, can save government when we have a lot of protest against government. I think according to this approach, we can see in future if Islamic Republic can continue, because somebody says it's possible new riots, new big protests against government, and they can't control. Yes, if they can continue, in the next decade, I think we are waiting for more influence and more power by IRGC because Supreme Leader wants this situation. Because Supreme Leader thinks IRGC can keep government against protest of people. And second thing is the file of new leader. And Supreme Leader thinks when we go to crisis situation about next leader, when Khamenei dies, they think only IRGC can keep government. When it's possible, big protest by people against government when Khamenei dies, and only IRGC can keep government. With two reasons in domestic policy and two reasons in foreign policy. In foreign policy, they think Islamic Republic is powerful in Middle East and against United States, Israel, and Saudi. Why? because we have a missile program and we have a proxy group. We have to continue this one. And all of them, in domestic policy and foreign policy, this power created by IRGC. According to this approach in domestic and foreign policy, I think they will continue to this situation. And if we have a IRGC as a main player in domestic policy, in future, it's possible we have a military government. Military government, it's not, I don't talk about, for example, one member of IRGC as a president. It's more important than president. They will go to more influence and more power by IRGC in all sections, in economic, in domestic policy, foreign policy, and they need to this approach. I think according to this approach, they are ready to announce Ibrahim Raisi as a new president and then as a new leader. But after Khamenei, main player, I think, is IRGC, because the next leader, it's not powerful leader. He needs to support by IRGC.
Right. Thank you, Murad. Barbara, I'm simplifying massively here, but you could make the argument that this US-Iran fight began in '79 when a bunch of one faction in the Khomeini circle decided, let's take those American diplomats hostage till we get the Shah back, and then we'll go forward from there. And then 42 years later, the United States plays this center role again in terms of domestic political calculations by factions in Tehran, which is really, in that sense, fascinating. But let me ask you, Barbara, if you could react to what you just heard from Murad and maybe myself. And then we have three questions for you. Basically, one way or another, all of them tied to the issue of the JCPOA. One question asked, is JCPOA even necessary? I mean, doesn't the non-nuclear proliferation treaty deal with that sort of issue? And you mentioned the issue of JCPOA being a test. The question here, was there any evidence that Iran didn't fully comply with JCPOA before Trump withdrew in 2018? And that raises the question of, what do you mean by a test? If we're talking about number centrifuges, then Iran was within the deal. But if you're hoping that Iran will come out and say, let's talk about Syria, Iraq, and all that stuff, well, that never happened. So the definition of what is a test, I think, is key. And last question for you is on external or third-party actors taking advantage of the situation, and the United States, this Biden administration, been concerned about it, namely China. Basically, I think what the questioner is asking is the U.S. worried that Iran's going to turn into be a Chinese gas station, if you put it that way?
Okay, well, let me try to get to all of those briefly. Iran was in compliance with the nuclear agreement before Trump pulled out, which was a major reason why Trump's advisors told him to stay in the deals. So he didn't like that answer, so he fired them, and he got new people who would tell him to get out, namely Pompeo and Bolton. In terms of, do we need a JCPOA? Well, yes, Iran is a member of the NPT. It's promised never to make nuclear weapons, but it makes a lot of countries uneasy if Iran has large stockpiles of highly or more and more enriched uranium. It's not a country that's trusted to have that, and the JCPOA was meant to cap those activities for a fairly long period of time. Even though a lot of the time has passed, if Iran goes back into the deal, it can't have more than 300 kilograms of low enriched uranium until the beginning of 2031. That's 10 years in which Iran could not build a bomb, simply would not have the fissile material to make one. So I think it's still worthwhile. As to China, China has benefited enormously from US sanctions policy. And this goes back, frankly, more than a decade, when the sanctions were put on under the Obama administration. It used to be that the European Union was Iran's largest trading partner. Starting around 2011, 2012, China became Iran's largest trading partner. And this is not something most Iranians like. They still would rather have products from from Europe and the United States. They'd still rather have investment from Europe and the United States. But if that prospect is foreclosed by sanctions, then they'll go where they can. And of course, China has improved over the last decade, and its products and services are much better than they used to be. That said, I think most Iranians still don't look east. They look west. And if you look at where the Iranian diaspora is, it's in the United States, it's in Canada, it's in Europe, it's in Australia, and you just don't see that many Iranians who want to go to China for their college and post college education. So that's still a card we can play, I think, with the Iranian people.
Thank you, Barbara. Ken, let me actually sort of build on what Barbara just said. And, you know, I tend to agree with Barbara that most Iranians would rather look west than east, but I think that also reflects which part of the Iranian society we're talking about. And the ones who look west, they actually want to leave Iran and emigrate to west. Whereas many of the ones in Iran who want to be in Iran, looking for international connections, perhaps out of not having many choices, are going to China. So you see growth of the Chinese business community, Iranian business community over the last 20 years in China. I mean, now you can learn Chinese in school in Iran and all the rest of it, which touches on the question here for you, Ken. The role of countries like China and Russia and others taking advantage, or maybe taking advantage is the wrong phrase here, but positioning themselves for maximum benefit out of US sanctions on the Iranian energy sector, which is a key part of the economy, used to be. I know they've diversified a fair bit, but what's the impact like on the sanctions? And if these sanctions continue, would that force the Revolutionary Guards, which is a big part of the economy, to rush even further into the arms of the Russians and the Chinese?
Well, it's not just that, you know, I mean, yeah, I mean, Iran is going to look to anybody that's willing to violate or risk being sanctioned by the United States. And China clearly has been willing to risk it. As I said, China is actually buying more oil from Iran than it did even in 2011, before the first set of sanctions and oil sanctions in 2011. China was buying about 600,000 barrels a day back then. It's now buying 800,000, maybe even 1 million barrels a day of Iranian oil. So Russia, obviously, a big strategic actor, not particularly afraid of being sanctioned by the United States. The United States does not have much leverage over China in that way. Clearly willing to risk the sanctions, but there's other violent. Turkey, you know, one of the ways Iran has been able to muddle through this period of heavy U.S. sanctions is through Turkey. There's some sort of deal going on with gold, and I haven't quite figured it out. It's been the subject of some court cases and investigations. What I can piece together is that the Turkish government was allowing Iran to draw down its assets in a bank called Halk Bank, and using Turkish gold traders was able to draw down and pay for gold, and the gold is trucked into Iran somehow. Gold is a reserve currency. Gold is a usable currency. Iran shipped gasoline to Venezuela. And what did Maduro do? He shipped gold. Iran shipped back, or plane flew it on an aircraft, gold, $400 million worth of gold. So Iran has found these ways to get around U.S. sanctions, but you know, they still take a very big bite. You know, as I said, the dollar is by far the major currency on the globe. And if you don't have access to the U.S. financial system, and no matter what you do, it is going to tie your hands. Companies are not going to want to go into Iran, you know, unless they can get easy access to the U.S. dollar. And this is a card that the Biden administration, I think, is going to hold out for maybe subsequent negotiations with Iran.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, but I just wanted to sort of do a quick round, and please, you know, anything you wanted to sort of say before we leave for today, do so. But let me, you know, refer to one question here that, you know, all three of you could perhaps comment on, which is this issue of deal or no deal, as these talks in Vienna continue, possible impact on this. We talked a lot about the Iranian economy. What about democratization in Iran? If there is a deal or not a deal, what role could relations with the outside world have on the internal political dynamics in that country? Let me start with Murad, Barbara, and then Ken, and then we wrap up.
I think we are not waiting to any evolution in domestic policy or foreign policy after tactical deal, because before deal and after deal main players are Supreme Leader and IRGC, and we are not waiting for any main change in domestic policy and foreign policy. They will continue their approach in foreign policy against USA and in Middle East with Saudi, with Israel, and in domestic policy, they will continue the suppression of people, majority of people. They are not satisfied about their situation, but approach of government is continue to suppression of people.
Thank you. Barbara, business as usual?
Yeah, I'm afraid I agree with Murad. I don't see many prospects for a breakthrough for democracy in Iran in the near future, and I'm very sorry to say that.
Thank you. And can you get the last word?
Well, you know, I feel like I'm on Howie Mandel's Deal or No Deal here show, but I think there's going to be a deal. You know, I think, you know, again, if you read the comments of both sides, the JCPOA is very clear on what each side must do, and both sides have said they're willing to go back to that 2015 deal. So I think it's not rocket science to get a deal. And as I said, I think Iran needs it. And I think President Biden's team wants it. A lot of the people that are in his administration were the people that negotiated the JCPOA to begin with. They're very true believers in it, feel it's strategically wise, and want to go back to it. So I think the default is that there will be a deal.
Thank you. Thank you, Kenneth Katzman. Thank you, Barbara Slavin. Thank you, Murad Vaisi. You guys have been wonderful. Thanks for your insights. Thanks for those who tuned in to listen to this panel. Thanks for your questions. We hope you join us again for many more, I'm sure, Middle East